Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 29. Today we'll discuss revision strategies with a focus on performing line edits. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your project form materials, as well as a document to write on. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define and explore local edits. We'll examine the rhetorical influence of correct grammar and mechanics. And we'll explore strategies for effectively performing line edits. Defining local edits. Over the course of this semester, we've talked about revision quite a bit. And through those discussions, you'll recall that revision is often broken down into two camps. You have your local revisions and your global revisions. Up until this point, depending on the mini lectures that you've watched, most of our content has focused on global concerns. And remember, those are higher stake concerns that will impact the meaning and the persuasiveness of the document as a whole. Though things that we often look at with global concerns include organization, tone or voice, and much like we talked about during the previous core lecture, content development, or more specifically, argument development as we examined it in the previous core lecture. In each one of these, if you make a change to one, oftentimes it will impact the document overall. So if I say, you know what, I want to put my argument at the end of my paper and allow my audience to sort of arrive there themselves, that's going to change how you talk about the evidence, how you introduce your sources, the type of language that you use to frame your reason. So you can see how a change in organization like that influences your content development, which is going to change the words that you use, which might impact the tone or the voice. And so you can see how making these changes in a regarding a global concern can impact the document overall. Now, lower or local concerns, those are going to be lower stake concerns that really only impact the sentence it resides in. So these are going to be things like sentence structure, spelling, and subject-verb agreement. Because if I have a comma splice in one sentence, chances are strong it's not going to completely derail my argument. The reader might stumble over that sentence a time or two. They might have to revisit it to ensure that they fully understand it, but at the end of the day, if I have a comma splice, it's not going to impact the logical persuasiveness of my overall argument. Of course, you don't want to leave a comma splice in there if you find it, but again, you can sort of see how local edits really only impact the sentence it resides in, whereas global concerns really can influence your argument and your document overall. Interestingly enough, writers in general tend to look at local edits or local concerns first. I really don't know why. I think it's just because those typically tend to be the easiest to pick out. But what I will say is local edits, local concerns should be the absolute last thing you do. Now, I know it can be tempting to say, let's go through and revise for all possible spelling mistakes I might have or comma mistakes I may see. So yes, that can be very tempting, but the reason that I would recommend for approaching your local concerns last. Let's say you go through and you do all of the line edits and that you could possibly think to do. You have corrected every comma splice, all fragments, all of your subjects and verbs agree perfectly. But, so you've got technically speaking a perfect document, but then you go through and say, oh, my tone isn't my argument doesn't come off how I would like it to, or my organization just doesn't seem to flow. So now you're thinking about concerns or concepts that ultimately might lead you to trash most, if not all, of this technically perfect document. So get the content in order before you decide to do your line edits. Basically, make sure that your car is built. Make sure your car is built before you put it through the car wash. And we can see that building the car is similar to global concerns, while putting it through the car wash is more local concerns. This will save you a lot of time in the long run. So I know that global concerns can be intimidating. I think they are for almost every writer out there. But rip the band-aid off, look at the global concerns first, and then once you feel comfortable to say the argument achieves the purpose that I had intended for it, my tone is where I want it to be, I have incorporated evidence how I've wanted to. Once you feel confident with your overall argument development, then you can again move on to the local concerns, the local edits, or the line edits. Some basic consideration for local edits, or again line edits, I use those terms interchangeably, but you can sort of see how that came to be because, you know, with local edits, you're really just going line by line and making sure that things are okay. So local edits, I do use interchangeably with line edits. Anywho, consideration for those edits include sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, and spelling. I want to point out that there are mini lectures on each one of these. We are briefly going to discuss them in this lecture in case you have not watched all three or any of these quite yet. So do just keep that in mind. We're going to be going over these concepts fairly quickly, but if you would like to learn more about them and have not watched the corresponding mini lecture yet, I would encourage you to do that. So let's think first about sentence structure. Now, each subject should clearly communicate one complete thought, and in doing so, abide by a clear subject-verb structure. Another way of looking at that structure would be an actor performing an action. So if we were to look at the sentence, the American Red Cross of Southern Utah serves nearly all of Southern Utah and parts of Arizona and Nevada. So in this case, the American Red Cross of Southern Utah. That will be our subject. That is our actor. That is the person, place, or thing performing, actually doing the action that the sentence focuses on. Now, what is that action for this sentence? In this sentence, the action or the verb would be the word serves. That is what the American Red Cross of Southern Utah is doing. So each sentence, in order to be a complete sentence and to be grammatically correct, needs to have that clear actor performing an action structure. A common issue with sentences is that for some writers is that sometimes they leave out one of those components, creating what's called a sentence fragment. So a more technical definition of that would be phrases that do not express a complete, coherent thought. Oftentimes they lack either a subject or a predicate, or a word we can use interchangeably with predicate would be verb. So if we were to look at these two sentences, the first one reads, last summer, though the area saw one of the most intense fire seasons in recent memory. Okay, it just almost kind of sounds like that idea got cut off before the person could finish that thought, because we don't really have a very clear actor performing an action. So we want to revise this sentence or this sentence fragment to include the missing components, and we want to revise to make sure that those are clearly identifiable to our readers. So last summer, though the area saw one of the most intense fire seasons in recent memory, the American Red Cross still performed their services for those in the area. So our revised sentence has a clear subject, the American Red Cross, and a clear verb or predicate performed their services, and of course for those in the area. So we have said, okay, the first sentence fragment didn't include a subject or a verb, so we're going to revise to again make sure that that complete thought is there, expressed through the structure of an actor performing an action. We also want to consider run-on sentences, which is sort of the opposite problem that we would see with a sentence fragment. So this is a sentence that contains more than one complete thought without proper punctuation. Now, I will say that you certainly can string together more than one complete thought into a single sentence, but that's when we start to use the comma conjunctions. So comma and, comma but, or you can use a semicolon and a transition word. So you can certainly string together multiple complete thoughts. You just want to make sure that your punctuation is keeping up with that approach. So if we look at this here, the first sentence reads, the American Red Cross has served the area for decades. They often even assist local emergency responders during other emergencies. Okay. So we can see here that there are two thoughts going on, and as the reader, I might be confused as to how I should read this. Where should the emphasis be? Who should I understand as the primary actor and the primary action of this sentence? Because we've got two equally well-developed thoughts that are just kind of pushed together. If we look at the following example, though, how we might revise that, we could put these two complete ideas, complete thoughts, and we could assign them their own sentences and give them their own complete simple sentence structure. So the American Red Cross has served the area for decades. Okay, boom, complete thought, grammatically correct sentence. American Red Cross, subject, serves the area, verb. So there's one complete thought. They often even assist local emergency responders during other emergencies. They, subject, assist local emergency responders. Verb, so the action. So we've got, in both instances of these new simple sentences, we have a very clear actor performing an action structure. Again, when looking at a run-on, or as we're about to discuss, a comma splice, really there's no correct way or absolute best way of revising them. So comma conjunction might be rhetorically appropriate. You find maybe giving them each their own sentence, so making two complete simple sentences, maybe that's your best bet. Maybe again using a semicolon and a transition word is most rhetorically effective for what you want the sentence to do. So if you notice that you see a run-on, or again, like we'll discuss here in a second, a comma splice, there are multiple ways that you can approach it, and how you decide to correct that is ultimately up to you, and whatever you think is going to be the most rhetorically effective option. All right, so comma splice. So that's a sentence that connects two complete sentences only with a comma. So it's like a run-on, but instead of having nothing in between the two sentences, there's a comma in between it. So we've got this first example here. During a standard blood drive, the American Red Cross collects hundreds of pints of blood, comma, they then return these donations to the headquarters in Las Vegas. So we can already see American Red Cross collects, subject, verb, actor performing an action. They then return these donations. So again, they, subject, return, verb, so actor performing an action. But to separate these two complete thoughts, we've only got a comma, which is something we want to avoid. We can see here a revised version of that sentence could read, during a standard blood drive, the American Red Cross collects hundreds of pints of blood, comma, and they then return these donations to the headquarters in Las Vegas. So just by adding the word and, we have made this a grammatically correct sentence. We have included an appropriate conjunction to make this a compound sentence. I could have also said, comma, so they then, or comma, yet they then return these donations. There, again, depending on what I want the sentence to do and how I want the reader to understand that information, I could have taken a number of different approaches, but comma conjunction, we can see would have worked here. We also could have done how we fixed the run-on sentence here, where we just made them two separate but simple sentences. Again, you could also use a semicolon and a transition. So like, semicolon, consequently, they then return these donations, or semicolon, however, they then return these donations. So really, it all rests on what you as the writer think is going to help your audience best understand that sentence in the way you want them to. Let's switch gears to discuss subject-verb agreement. Subject-verb agreement is ensuring that the singular plural nature of your subjects and verbs align. So, easiest way to remember it, if a subject is singular, its verb must also be singular. If a subject is plural, its verb must also be plural. Where this can get a bit tricky is thinking about how we use the letter S or the suffix es to make something plural. So for example, we've got the correct version on top here to say the dogs benefit from the enrichment toys. So we have got DOGS to indicate more than one dog, but rather than include benefits, we don't want to include an S on the end of our verb there. So, I could also say the dog benefits because the dog doesn't have an S on the end, it's singular. We want to add an S to our verb to also indicate that it's singular. So we can read the following example, the dog's benefits from the enrichment toys. That even just sounds off because we have an S ending both the subject and the verb here. So to fix, we'd have to remove one of the S's. So the dog benefits from the enrichment toys, or like our first example, the dogs benefit from the enrichment toys. We also want to be aware of spelling. Even with things like autocorrect and spell check, we do want to keep a critical eye out to ensure that we are spelling words correctly. Yeah. So first off, ensure all names are spelled correctly, especially with the sources that you introduce. Remember that when you reference a source in your text, I, as the reader, might say, hey, this is really interesting. I'd love to read more from this source. And so if it's spelled incorrectly, either in your text or on your references or works cited page, that could lead to confusion for your reader. You also want to keep a close eye out for homophones. So those are going to be the words that sound the same, but are spelled differently and have different meanings. So there, and there, it's and its, to, by, whose and whose. So each one of these has a specific meaning. Again, even though they might sound the exact same to another word that's spelled differently, they will have unique spellings, unique definitions, and it's important to remain aware of those. You also want to keep an eye out for autocorrect features. Like I said, it can be really challenging to not look out for spelling when we are revising, just because there's almost like this false sense of security, like, oh, Word or Pages will catch that, or Google Docs will catch that for me. Not necessarily. And also, pending what word processing software that you're using to type up your drafts and submit your work, sometimes these programs can take it upon themselves to say, oh, this word was misspelled, but I really know what you meant. And that's really not the case. So you want to make sure that you're going through your work with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that all of the words that are in your document are the words that you intended to be there, and not the words that Word or Pages or Docs thinks that you meant. When we think of additional strategies to perform line edits especially, you first want to read your text out loud. Your voice, so saying the actual words, reading your own work can give you an idea of how your audience will engage with your text. So maybe as you go through, you find yourself saying, oh my gosh, I use a lot of really long sentences and I felt winded reading it out loud. So I can only imagine what my reader might feel. Or maybe you come across a sentence that's like grammatically correct, but just sounds awkward. Maybe you say, oh, I feel like I added in prepositions in the wrong place. Or I felt like, I could change how I introduce this idea to be, briefer and easier to identify and understand. So read your text out loud and read it as if you would in an everyday conversational speaking voice. So if you and a friend were chatting and you were just to start reading your work, read it at that pace. And that is most often when you can catch any content that might sound awkward, or that you might identify as a part of your text that you can revisit to revise. For smaller issues like spelling and even subject-verb agreement, I would even go so far as to recommend reading syllable by syllable. This is actually a common practice with professional and technical writers, where they will go through and, additional strategies. Read your text out loud. Read syllable by syllable. What that does, so after you've initially read your text out loud at that kind of conversational pace, and you say, okay, yeah, it sounds all right, this is what's going to help you say, are all my words spelled correctly? Do my subjects and my verbs align? Have I identified any sentence fragments, comma splices, run-ons, things of that sort? And slowing down and reading syllable by syllable will give you a better opportunity to catch any of those smaller concerns that you might have throughout your piece. I'd also recommend reading the text backwards. So starting from your very last word and going all the way to the front. What this does is oftentimes when we read through our personal written work from start to finish, we almost know what to expect. And so we might gloss over areas that we need to revise. If we read the text backwards, though, sure, it may not make a lot of sense, but you are sort of robbing your mind of the opportunity to just sort of go on autopilot and again glaze over things that might need additional attention. And for record keeping purposes, I would recommend track all changes you've made either on a digital or physical copy. Maybe there's one sentence in particular you find yourself saying, oh, it's a grammatically correct sentence. It just doesn't read how I want it to. And so if you edit that specific sentence, maybe, you change a draft or change that sentence in between draft one and draft two. Then you're reading over draft two and you say, oh man, this sentence, it's still reading awkwardly. I think it read better, in the first draft that I created. Okay, well, if you've tracked your changes or saved multiple iterations of your draft over time, you can say, all right, I'm going to go back, I'm going to copy and paste that sentence I had from draft one that I prefer, and I will incorporate it into my third draft and see how I might revise it if I want to once I've completed revisions of the draft that I'm working on, in this case, perhaps the third draft. So Keep your receipts, keep your records, because you never know what you're going to want to use later and incorporate into later drafts. All right, so for the lecture assignment, I would like you to review the materials you currently have for your Project 4. Based on the feedback you've received in the past, both in this course as well as others, what are 3 things you will keep a close eye out for while performing line edits? How do you think this will improve your final submission? How do you think the methods mentioned will help you edit successfully? Keep in mind this is a brief reflection, so it should be around 50 words, no more than 50 words. Again, this is really an opportunity to say, before I submit my final paper, what are some things that I've historically been made aware of and that I want to keep a close eye out for from here on out. All right, so folks, that does it. So for the weekly homework, make sure that you include your core lecture 29 summary and assignment in that submission. Overall, your week 15 homework submission should include the summaries and lecture assignments from core lectures 28 and 29, as well as the summary and lecture assignment of a mini lecture of your choice. That is all going to be due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, April 21st. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everybody, signing off from our final core lecture.